At my own retirement party, my son stood up in front of everyone and said, "My father has dementia. I have already arranged for him to move into a nursing home. Do you understand, Dad?" Then he smiled and looked at his wife with satisfaction. I did not answer. I stood up, reached into my breast pocket, and pulled out my phone. Then I pressed play and my son's own voice filled the room. Everyone around that table froze in shock. "Welcome and thank you for being here. What would you have done in that moment, stayed silent or pressed play? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Note this is a work of fiction, but the meaning behind it is worth staying for. My son was still smiling when he said the word decline, and every one of the 47 people in that backyard went so still I could hear the ice shifting in the glasses around me. It was a retirement party, my retirement party. Late April, a Saturday. The kind of afternoon Old Hickory Lake produces maybe 6 times a year. The water calm and wide behind the house, the oak trees throwing long shadows across the lawn. The light carrying that particular quality of late spring that makes ordinary things look like they have been arranged by someone who cared about the composition. Someone had strung a canvas tent between the trees. Someone had ordered enough food for twice the number of people standing on my grass. I had worn the suit Loretta picked out the year before she got sick, because she had always said it made me look like a man who had somewhere important to be. I needed that on this particular afternoon more than I had needed anything in a long time. My son stood at the center of that lawn, holding a champagne flute and a speech he had clearly practiced in a mirror. He had his mother's jaw and my height, and he used both of those things the way men do when they want a room to trust them, before they have said anything worth trusting. He started with gratitude. He listed years. He mentioned a bridge I had helped inspect in 1987 that still carries traffic over the Cumberland today. The 47 guests nodded. A few of them lifted their glasses early. 40 years of reading structural stress teaches a man one thing above everything else. The failure is never where you are looking when it starts. The shift happened between one sentence and the next. My son's voice did not rise. It did not shake. It simply changed temperature the way a room changes when someone opens a window in winter and then closes it again before you can be sure it happened. He used the word decline the way a man uses a word he has chosen very carefully and practiced saying until it sounds clinical rather than cruel. He said the family had been concerned for some time. He said I was no longer able to manage the demands of independent living. He said these things in the same measured tone he had used to describe the bridge, as if the bridge and I were the same category of aging infrastructure requiring evaluation. His wife stood beside him. She is a woman who holds her expression the way a person holds a door deliberately, with awareness of exactly how much she is letting through. She was composed now, her hand on my son's arm, and everything about the two of them together in that moment looked exactly like a photograph taken for a purpose. Meadowbrook. He had already chosen the name of the place they planned to put me. Meadowbrook Senior Living, by the end of May. Already arranged. He said all of it, standing on my lawn under my oak trees, wearing a shirt I had probably paid for at some point. And the 47 people around him went quiet in the way people go quiet when they are deciding whether what they just heard was real. I watched my daughter from across the yard. She was not surprised. I had known she would not be surprised. Her face held the particular stillness of someone who came to a fire, already knowing it would be set, and who brought something in her bag because of it. My oldest friend was at the front table. I watched his face move through confusion and land somewhere that looked very much like fury, and I was grateful for that, and I stored it away the way I store things I might need later. My son turned and looked directly at me. "Do you understand, Dad?" He actually asked me that in front of 47 people whether I understood. "We just want what is best for you, Dad. You understand, don't you? I have spent 67 years as a man who solves problems before he reacts to them. I spent 31 of those years as a bridge inspector for the state of Tennessee, which is a profession that teaches you above everything else, that the moment of failure is never the moment of surprise. The failure begins long before anyone is watching. What you are witnessing at the end is only the conclusion of a process that started somewhere quiet, somewhere no one thought to look. I had been looking for 6 months. My hand rested on the breast pocket of my jacket. Inside it, a single folded document I had carried there since 7 o'clock that morning. My son was still waiting for his answer. The 47 people were still waiting. The lake behind the house made no sound at all. I did not answer him. Instead, I turned to the 47 people on my lawn and I told them my name. I am 67 years old. I am a retired bridge inspector for the state of Tennessee. And I would like to tell you something about the morning this party was planned. There is a silence that means people are surprised, and there is a silence that means people are ashamed for you, and every person at that table knew exactly which one this was. I had given them my name, Elwood Vance, 67 years old, retired bridge inspector for the state of Tennessee. I said it the way I used to introduce myself at a job site, not as a greeting, but as a statement of record. The kind of introduction that means, I am here now, I have noted what I found, and we are going to talk about it. A few of the 47 people shifted in their chairs. One woman near the back set her glass down very carefully, as if she suddenly did not trust herself to hold it. Garrett had not moved. He was still standing in the center of the lawn with the champagne flute in his hand, and his expression had done something complicated, not collapsed, not recovered, but rearranged itself into a version of patience that did not reach his eyes. I know that expression. I had been watching it arrange itself across his face for the better part of 6 months. I looked at Deanna first. She was nodding slowly the way a person nods when they have practiced nodding, when the nod is not a response to anything but a performance of one. Her hands were folded at her waist, and her smile had not changed, and that consistency was its own kind of information. A genuine smile changes when the room changes. Deanna's did not change, because it was not connected to anything genuine. I had spent 38 years reading the silence inside concrete, the kind that comes just before a structure tells you it is done holding. I looked at Felix next. Felix Drummond was seated at the front table 3 feet from where I was standing, and he was not looking at Garrett. He had not looked at Garrett once since the word decline had left my son's mouth. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who is giving you room to do what you are about to do. Felix has always understood that the most useful thing a person can do in a crisis is stay out of the way of the person handling it. I had always respected that about him. I respected it especially now. Cora's hands were flat on her knees. Not gripping, not trembling, flat, deliberate, the specific stillness of someone who arrived at a place already knowing the weather and dressed accordingly. I did not look at her for long. Looking at Cora too directly in that moment would have told Garrett something I was not ready to tell him yet. The room was still quiet. The lake behind the house had gone silent in the way it does in late afternoon, when the wind drops and the surface flattens to glass. And the combination of that silence and the 47 people in it was the kind of stillness I have only encountered a few times in my professional life, once on a bridge catwalk in Shelby County. 1994, when I found a fracture in a load-bearing cable that no one else had noticed. The supervisor had kept talking. I had stopped moving. The moment I stopped was the moment the room understood something was wrong, even before I said a word. This was the same moment. He had practiced this. My son had stood in front of a mirror and practiced telling people his father was losing his mind. I reached into my breast pocket. Garrett's eyes moved. 1 second, maybe less, a single downward glance before he recovered the patient's expression. But I saw it. I see most things. It is an occupational habit I never managed to set down. I did not take out the document. I took out my phone and set it face up on the table in front of me. A plain screen, nothing visible. Garrett's jaw moved the way jaws move when the owner of the jaw is deciding whether to speak. "Dad, you don't need to," he began. "I know I don't," I said. 2 words. I have thought about those 2 words since, and I believe they were the right 2. Not because they were clever, because they were accurate. I did not need to do anything Garrett had planned for me to do. I had not needed to for quite some time. The problem was that he did not know that yet. You want to know what is on that phone. I know you do. So did Garrett, and that was the whole point. My thumb rested on the screen. 6 months of recordings accumulated the way an engineer accumulates evidence before he writes the report that ends a project patiently without announcement in the order in which things happened. I had not planned to use them today. I had planned to use them in a law office in front of a specific set of people at a time of my choosing. That morning, I had found out what had already been filed against my house. That changed the schedule. I pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the table and held them there, steady. Then I reached back into my pocket and looked at the 47 people still waiting on my lawn. "Before I tell you what happened next," I said, "let me tell you what happened first. A bridge does not fail the day it falls. It fails the day someone ignores the first crack. I want to tell you about the crack. I want to tell you exactly when I heard it and what I did and what I found when I went looking. Then you will understand everything about this afternoon, including why I am the one still standing at the end of it. The morning of the day I ended my son's plans was the quietest morning I can remember, and I had spent 38 years in rooms where the wrong kind of quiet meant something was about to break. I want to tell you about the crack. I promised you the crack. But before I get there, I need to take you back one more stop to the morning of the party itself, because the morning is where the shape of a thing is clearest. After the afternoon, everything becomes about what happened. Before it, you can still see why. I was up at 5:30. Old habit, not intention. I made coffee the way I have made it every morning for the past 4 years. 1 cup black, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the lake. The party tent had gone up the day before, and I could see it through the glass, a white canvas shape between the oak trees still in the early light. No workers yet, no cars in the driveway. Just the tent and the lake and the sound of nothing, which is its own kind of sound once you learn to hear it. I had already checked the breast pocket twice before I got out of bed. I checked it once more at the kitchen counter, and then I made myself stop checking it. The document was there. It had been there since the attorney's office on Thursday. Checking it again would not make it more there. Some men prepare for a hard day by praying. I prepared by checking the sequence one more time, the same way I checked load calculations before I signed my name to a bridge. Not because I doubted the numbers, because signing your name to something means you have looked at it with your own eyes in the right order, without skipping anything. I went through the sequence over my coffee, Cora's folder, Felix's position at the front table, the phone in my pocket beside the document, the 47 guests who would be here by 2 o'clock, most of them people who had known my family for 20 years, which meant most of them were people who would remember what they saw today for the rest of their lives. That mattered. Witnesses are not furniture. Witnesses are architecture. The phone rang at 8:17. I knew it would be Cora before I looked. My daughter has a quality I have always respected. She does not call to be reassured. When Cora calls, she calls because she has something to report, or something to confirm. And she keeps it brief because she already knows that I already know the important parts. We have talked like this since her mother died in shorthand in the compressed language of two people who have already done the long version of every conversation and now only need the coordinates. Everything is where it needs to be, she said. Felix knows his part. And you're certain about the timing, I asked. I've been certain for 3 weeks, Dad. See you at noon. That was it. Under 3 minutes. Neither of us said Garrett's name once. 3 weeks. My daughter had been certain for 3 weeks, and I had not asked her to be certain sooner because I already was. I rinsed the coffee cup and walked the length of the hallway the way I do most mornings, slowly without purpose. The way you walk a familiar structure, not because you are inspecting it, but because your body has learned the dimensions of it and finds comfort in the knowing. The photographs on the left-hand wall go back 40 years. My wife is in most of them. She is younger in some and less young in others, and in all of them, she has the expression of a woman who understood exactly where she was standing and chose to be there. I stopped at one photograph near the end of the row. Garrett at perhaps 19, my height, already my jaw. Squinting into afternoon sun on a job site in Murfreesboro, where I had taken him for a Saturday because he had asked to come, and I had been glad he asked. His arm was around my shoulders in that photograph. My arm was around his. We were both looking at something outside the frame, something one of us had pointed at, and whoever was holding the camera had caught the exact moment before we turned back to each other. Do you know what it costs a man to look at a photograph of his son and feel nothing except readiness? I know. I paid it that morning. I did not look at the photograph to feel something. I looked at it to make sure I no longer did. There is a difference, and the difference matters. A man who acts out of grief makes mistakes. A man who has already moved through grief and come out the other side, with his evidence intact, makes something else entirely. I heard the gravel shift under the first tires in the driveway. Early, which meant it was Felix has never been late to anything in 60 years of living. I turned from the photographs and walked toward the door. The sequence was in order. The document was in my pocket. The phone was beside it. Cora was 30 minutes out. Felix was already on the property. By the time the first guest reached the backyard, I was already in position, and so was everything else. Now, let me take you back to where it started, 6 months before that tent went up between the oak trees. 6 months before I stood at that kitchen window and knew exactly what the day would cost and decided it was worth it. Let me take you back to the first crack. My son called me Superman when he was 4 years old, and I believed the way only a father can believe that I had earned it. This is the crack, not the financial one, not the legal one. This is the one underneath all the others, the one that was there before any document was signed or any plan was made. If you want to understand how a man ends up standing in his own backyard on a Saturday afternoon in April, holding a folded document in one pocket and 6 months of recordings in another, you have to start here, at the lake. In 1995, with a boy on your shoulders who weighs 38 pounds and is absolutely certain you cannot be knocked down. The path ran along the eastern edge of the property. Below the oak line and above the water line, a stretch of packed dirt and exposed root that I had walked so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. That afternoon I could not see much past Garrett's knees. He had both hands gripped flat against my forehead, fingers spread the way children hold on when they are not actually afraid of falling, but want you to know they are trusting you anyway. The lake was high from spring rain, the water pressing close to the root line, and the oaks threw their shadows long across the path, so that walking it felt like moving through something layered and old. "You're Superman, Daddy," he said. "Nobody can knock you down." He was right then. I just did not know what would eventually try. I have held a lot of weight in my life: bridge calculations, structural reports, the silence after bad news. Nothing has ever weighed exactly what a 4-year-old boy weighs when he trusts you completely. I want you to carry that weight with me for a moment before I tell you the rest, because the rest is easier to understand if you feel the first thing first. Loretta Vance was my wife for 31 years. She was the load-bearing wall of our family, a fact I understood intellectually while she was alive and understood in my body the morning she was gone. I do not mean that she was quiet or that she worked in the background. I mean that she was the reason the temperature of every room in our house stayed at something a person could live in. She played piano on Sunday mornings, old hymns, mostly nothing showy, and when you heard it from the kitchen or the upstairs hallway, you knew without checking that everything was still all right. She kept a garden along the south fence that she never asked anyone to help with, and she left small notes in my lunch. Not love letters, not instructions, just observations. "The hydrangeas are coming. The left rear tire looks low. Garrett asked what the longest bridge in the world is. I told him to ask you. I want you to understand what Loretta was before I tell you what her absence did, because you cannot understand the second thing without knowing the first." Both children orbited her the way they were not aware they orbited her. Cora. Our daughter had Loretta's precision, the same quality of attention, the same habit of arriving at a conclusion before announcing it. Garrett had her warmth, or what becomes warmth when it is given room to grow. I have thought about this a great deal in the years since. What grows in the absence of the right conditions is not always what you planted. Sometimes it is something that looks similar from a distance and is different in every way that matters up close. But that is later. I am still at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, sometime in the early part of 2003, and Loretta is across from me. And young Cora is doing arithmetic homework with the eraser first approach she used, until she was 12 and Garrett 10 years old, long past Superman. Patient in the way children are patient when something genuinely interests them, is reading a library book about bridges. He had checked it out himself. He had not told me he was going to. Do you know what ordinary looks like when it is also perfect? It looks exactly like a Tuesday. It looks like a boy reading a library book about bridges because his father builds them. Dad, Garrett said, not looking up. "How many cars can a bridge hold before it breaks?" "The right bridge," I said. "As many as you build it for." Loretta looked at me across the table. "That is the best answer you have ever given," she said quietly, the way she said most things that mattered. The lake was visible through the kitchen window, the same lake, the same window. The food on the table was plain. No one was performing anything for anyone. We were 4 people in a kitchen on an unremarkable evening, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of enough that you do not have a name for while you are inside it. That dinner was in February of 2003. 8 months later, Loretta sat across that same table and told me the doctor had found something. The lake looked exactly the same through the window. Nothing else did. There is a specific kind of morning that changes everything that comes after it, and you only recognize it as such once you are standing on the other side. The appointment was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Tuesdays were my short days at the office, the days I was usually home by 4, and I had told Loretta I would drive her. She had said it was not necessary. I had said it was not a question. That was the full negotiation. We drove in, found parking on the first pass, walked into a waiting room with tan carpet and a television mounted too high on the wall, showing a morning program neither of us watched at home. Loretta sat down and opened a paperback she had carried in her coat pocket. She did not read a single page of it. I watched her eyes stay on the same paragraph for 11 minutes before the nurse called her name. I have since learned to distrust mornings that feel like nothing, the ones that feel like something at least you can prepare for. It is the ordinary ones that take you. She had already gone once without me. I found that out 3 weeks later. She had already gone and already heard something that required a second look and decided to wait before she told me what she had heard. I have thought about why she did that. I have had 20-some years to think about it. The most honest answer I have arrived at is this: Loretta knew me. She knew that I operate best when I have a complete picture rather than a partial one, and she did not yet have a complete picture. And she was protecting the version of me that would be most useful when the full information arrived. This is not a small thing. This is the kind of consideration that requires a person to manage their own fear alone in the dark for 2 weeks, so that someone else does not have to manage it prematurely. I did not deserve that. I received it anyway. The doctor came in and sat down the way doctors sit when they are about to say something they have said before, not without care, but with a practiced steadiness that tells you the chair and the words have been arranged this way many times. He said there was something he would like to look at more closely. He said a second opinion was always sensible. He used the word, "yet nothing to be alarmed about yet," and said they should schedule a follow-up. What do you do with a word like, "yet the doctor said, yet nothing to be alarmed about yet," and I have been living inside that word ever since. Loretta asked if Thursday worked for scheduling. The doctor said Thursday worked. She thanked him, closed the paperback that had been open in her lap the entire time, and stood up in the way she stood up from any chair, with the specific unhurriedness of a woman who has decided how she is going to move through a room before she moves through it. I followed her out. Neither of us spoke until we reached the parking lot. October in Middle Tennessee has a particular quality of light. Bare tree light, the sun lower than you expected. A gray that is not quite gray. More the color of something waiting to make up its mind. The parking lot held it the way flat surfaces hold light poorly, which is to say the whole thing looked a little wrong in a way I could not name. I took her hand. A bridge does not know it is failing. It only knows the weight. I think about that when I think about Loretta in that parking lot, how much she was already holding that I could not see. She squeezed back, once firm, the kind of pressure that is not affection, but communication, the kind that means I know and I am here and we are going to handle this. She said it was probably nothing. Her voice was the same voice she used for everything steady already, halfway to making peace with whatever came next. We walked to the car. We drove home on the same road we always drove home. No music. After the first few miles, no conversation either. Not because there was nothing to say, but because we were both doing the same quiet calculation and did not need to narrate it to each other. She looked out the window as we came along the lake road. The light was beautiful, she said. Just that. The light was beautiful. I have held load-bearing cables. I have run my hands along steel that carries 40,000 cars a day and felt it hum with the weight of all that trust. I have never felt anything hold as hard as her hand did in that parking lot. We drove home the same way we always drove home. She looked out at the lake and said the light was beautiful. It was the last appointment where either of us used the word probably. The next one had a different word entirely. 18 months later, I moved her reading chair 3 inches to the left, so I would stop reaching for her every time I walked past it. The year after she died did not announce itself as grief. It arrived as logistics, as silence, as the slow redistribution of weight across a structure that had been built for two. Not through the funeral, not through the paperwork, not through the specific weight of a house that used to have piano music in it on Sunday mornings, and now had nothing on Sunday mornings except the particular silence of a room that remembers what it is missing. I will tell you through the chair, 3 inches. Enough that my peripheral vision stopped registering it as occupied. That was the work of the first year, not healing, not moving on, nothing so clean as that. Just the patient, unglamorous redistribution of weight so that the whole structure could remain standing. Cora called every Sunday at noon. She called with purpose to report to check to confirm I had eaten something that required cooking. Garrett called when he remembered, which was less often than he thought and more often than I expected, and the calls were shorter each time. But I told myself that was what happened when a man his age was building something of his own. I told myself a version of that for several years. He asked me twice about the house while she was still alive. I thought he was being practical. I have since learned the difference between practical and preparatory. The first time was 6 weeks before Loretta died. When Garrett drove down on a Saturday and walked through the house the way people walk through houses when they are thinking about something they are not saying. He asked if the property was in both our names or just mine. I told him both. He nodded and said something about estate planning, about making sure everything was set up correctly, so I would not have complications down the road. I remember thinking he was being considerate. I remember being grateful. I filed those two facts in the same drawer and did not look at them again for 11 years. The second time was at the funeral reception, which I will say quickly and move past. Garrett pulled me aside near the end of the afternoon and asked whether Loretta had a will and whether I had updated mine. I told him I had an attorney. He said good, and the conversation ended. I told myself he was anxious that grief makes people reach for the practical because the practical is the only thing they can hold. That was true enough to be convincing. It was not the whole truth. I want to be honest with you about something. I saw it. Not all of it, not the shape of it, but I saw the edges, and I chose not to follow them. That is on me. 2 years after Loretta Garrett brought a woman to the house for the first time. She was composed in the way that some people are composed, not calm exactly, but arranged the way a room is arranged for a showing rather than for living in. She stood at the kitchen window and said the lake was gorgeous, which it is, but she said it the way people say things they have decided to say, rather than things they have just noticed. Garrett was louder than usual in her presence, slightly off his axis, performing a version of himself that was broader and more confident than the one I had always known. I told myself, this was love. I told myself this for years. The decade that followed was a decade of small degrees. Garrett's language shifted from, I'm working on something, to, I'm managing a portfolio. From let me know what you think, to, I've already made the call. The visits shortened but polished themselves into something shinier and harder to hold. He stopped asking questions. He started delivering conclusions. I cataloged each small change the way I would catalog a hairline in a cable, something to note, something to monitor, something not yet urgent enough to report. Love is also a form of looking away. I have thought about that sentence many times. I believe it is true, and I believe it is not an excuse. How long does a man have to choose not to see something before the choosing becomes its own kind of crime? I have asked myself that question every day since December. On a Tuesday afternoon in December of 2024, I walked in from the mailbox with a standard envelope county return address, my name in a typed font I did not recognize. The kind of envelope that looks like a bill or a notice and announces nothing about what it contains. I stood at the kitchen counter and opened it. The lake was the same through the window. The kitchen was the same. I read the document twice, which is something I do when I want to be certain I have understood correctly before I react to anything. My name was on a document I had never signed in an office I had never visited, against a loan I had never taken out on a house I had spent 30 years paying for. That was the first crack I could no longer walk past. Chapter 3 begins the morning after the morning. I decided I was going to find out exactly how long it had been going on, and exactly how much of my house was already gone. I was not there when it happened. She described it to me later that night, her voice barely above a whisper, and I listened the way I listen to everything that matters without interrupting, without reacting, letting each detail land in the right order before I moved to the next one. The December envelope had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 4 days by the time my daughter called. I had not told her about it yet. I was still running the sequence, still checking what I knew against what I could prove before I said anything to anyone. And then my phone rang at 9:47 on Christmas night, and the moment I heard the register she was using, I understood that whatever she had seen had moved ahead of my sequence on its own. She had arrived at the house early that afternoon. That part was deliberate. She wanted time before the others settled in, and she came through the side door the way she has done since she was 12, walking toward the kitchen, because that is where I am most mornings, and she expected to find me there. I was not there. What she found instead was my son's wife standing at the counter with her back turned. A small container sat beside a short glass of something clear. The container was not large. It was the kind that does not announce what it holds. My son's wife turned around in the time it takes a person who has practiced turning around quickly to do it. Her hands were already empty before she was fully facing my daughter. Whatever had been on the counter was gone. She looked at my daughter the way someone looks at an interruption they were prepared for. Not startled, not embarrassed, simply recalibrated. She said she had not heard her come in. She asked if she could get her something. Her voice carried no particular weight in either direction. My daughter said yes. She accepted whatever was offered, said something about the food, and walked into the other room as though the kitchen had been entirely ordinary. She told me later that the walk from the counter to the hallway was the longest 12 feet she had covered in her professional life. She said if she had changed her pace by a single step, if she had looked back once, the whole afternoon would have shifted into something she could not control, so she kept walking. She told me that took everything she had. I smiled at her for 2 hours, she said on the phone. I watched every glass she touched and every time she went back to that kitchen. 3 times. My son's wife went back to the kitchen 3 times across that afternoon, and 3 times my daughter watched her return to the table and set a glass down near my chair. Not my son's chair, mine. My daughter gave me each trip in the order. It happened with the precision she uses when she is building a timeline, the approximate duration of each absence, which direction the return came from, whether anything visible was carried back. On the 3rd return, nothing visible was carried. The glass beside my seat had been refilled. She went back 3 times, my daughter said. Each time your glass was the one that changed. 3 times. She counted 3 and she was not certain yet what it meant, but being uncertain was already enough. She made an excuse about an early morning before dessert. She said goodnight in the order, least likely to draw attention, and walked out to her car without looking back. What does a person decide in a dark car in a driveway while a porch light goes off inside a house? I have thought about that since she told me. She sat in that car without starting the engine. She sat long enough for the light inside the house to go dark long enough to be sure that no one was watching the window anymore. The neighborhood was quiet the way December neighborhoods are quiet when everyone is inside and the cold keeps the streets empty. She sat with the quiet and with what she had seen and with the distance between those 2 things, and then she made a decision. She did not call me from the driveway. She drove 20 minutes down the road, first putting distance between herself and the house before she trusted her own voice enough to use it. When she called, it was still Christmas night and she was still carrying 2 hours of performed calm that she had not yet been able to put down. She told me everything she had seen. She told it in the right order, without conclusions, attached only observations, the container, the hands, the recalibration, the 3 returns, the glass. When she finished, there was a silence, and in that silence I heard the thing she had not said yet. She had already made 1 call before she made mine. She had sat in that driveway until the light went off, and she had driven away, and before she called her father, she had called someone else. She did not tell me who that night. That was the part she was still deciding how to explain. I told her to get some sleep. I told her we would talk tomorrow. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter beside the envelope that had been sitting there for 4 days, and I looked at both of them for a long moment, the envelope I had found, the call I had just received, and I understood that I was no longer the only one who had been looking. For 5 days after Christmas, I woke before the light came and lay still in the dark and did not call her. She did not call me either. We were both deciding something, and we both understood, without saying it, that the decision required the full 5 days to become solid enough to act on. I know what 5 days of that kind of silence feels like from the inside. It does not feel like waiting. It feels like load testing the same process I used at the end of every major inspection. When the calculations were done and the materials were certified, and the only remaining question was whether the thing you had built would hold what you were about to put on it. You do not rush that test. You apply the weight carefully in increments, and you watch what happens at the joints. 5 days was the wait. The joints held. On the 5th day, she arrived without calling. I heard a car in the driveway at 2 in the afternoon and looked out the kitchen window and saw her walking toward the front door in December, cold with no coat on and a folder under her arm. The folder was accordion style, already full, the kind that expands to hold a substantial volume of documents. I registered these details in the order they mattered. No coat meant she had left, without deliberating, which meant the decision to come had arrived faster than the decision to dress for the weather. No call ahead meant she had been sitting somewhere building toward the drive. The folder meant she had not come to talk. She had come to show. I opened the door before she knocked. She came in and said, "Sit down first," and I sat. She laid it out in sequence the way she always lays things out. Christmas kitchen incident first, which I already knew from the phone call 5 nights earlier, and then the part she had not told me that night. 6 weeks before Christmas, she had found a financial document that my son had forwarded, asking her to notarize a signature. She had noticed a figure that did not correspond to anything she recognized as legitimate. She had not confronted him. Instead, she had called an old colleague of mine, a man she trusted, a man who knew how to look at numbers without disturbing the thing he was looking at. She had asked him to look quietly, and he had been looking for 3 weeks before Christmas. And she had been sitting with what he was finding for 3 weeks before she sat across from me at this table. I called him the night of Christmas, she said, but he had already started 3 weeks before that. I asked him too, when I first saw the statements. I sat with that for a moment. The Christmas kitchen incident had not been the beginning of her investigation. It had been the confirmation. My daughter had been building something against her brother for a month before the container on the counter, and she had done it correctly, and she had done it alone. And she had not told me because she was not yet certain enough to hand me something incomplete. She had been protecting the version of me that would be most useful when the full picture arrived, the same way her mother used to protect that version of me, in the same quiet, toward the same end. I was not angry. I was grateful she had not waited longer. She opened the folder to the first document and turned it to face me. I looked at it the way I look at any technical report, starting at the figures, moving to the dates, then to the signatures. I asked her how many documents had been compiled. She said enough to establish a pattern. I asked whether any of them had passed through my son's office in a way that would allow his attorney to argue the chain of evidence had been touched. She said no. The colleague she had called had been careful about that from the first day. That is exactly what he asked first too, she said quietly. Good, I said. That meant we were thinking correctly, which meant we had a chance. She had been doing this for a month. My daughter had been carrying this for a month alone, in the same silence I had been carrying the envelope on my counter, and neither of us had known the other was already moving. We had been building toward this kitchen table from opposite directions and parallel without a word between us. That was the part I needed a moment to absorb, not the documents, not the figures. The fact that we had both already started. I reached across the table and closed the folder and placed both hands flat on it. The lake was outside. The kitchen was quiet in the way it gets quiet in December when the trees are bare and the water holds all the sound the yard lets go. Nothing in the room had changed, and everything in it had. We do this carefully, I said. We do this right. I know, she said. She had already been doing it carefully for a month. I was the one catching up. What I did not tell her that afternoon, not yet, because I needed one more day to understand what it meant, was that the envelope on the counter had arrived 3 weeks before Christmas, that I had been carrying it the same way she had been carrying hers, that we had been moving toward each other across the same silence without knowing the other was already in motion. Some things require a full night before you can say them out loud. That was one of them. The office had no sign on the door. That was the first thing I noticed, and the first thing that told me Harlan Spade was exactly what Cora said he was. The building on Charlotte Avenue was a converted residential storefront in Sylvan Park, the kind of block where the structures remember being houses, and have only partially accepted their new purpose. The suite number was stenciled directly on the frosted glass, no name beneath it. Inside, 2 chairs along one wall, a table with nothing on it, no receptionist, no certificates on the wall. I have sat across from enough people in enough offices to know the difference between a room designed to reassure and a room designed to work. This one had been built entirely for the second purpose. Cora sat beside me. We did not speak while we waited. There was nothing to rehearse. Let me tell you what a man who spent 20 years catching financial criminals looks like when he is not performing anything for anyone. He looks exactly like Harlan Spade looked in that chair, like someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the evidence to catch up. Harlan Spade, former Nashville Metro financial crimes detective, late 50s, now operating a private investigations practice from this unmarked suite on Charlotte Avenue, came through the interior door without greeting us. He looked at me the way people look at someone they have already read a file on and are now calibrating against the paper. Then he sat down and spoke. Mr. Vance, he said, I have been looking at your son's firm for 3 weeks. You need to hear what I found before we talk about what comes next. He did not ask if I was ready. He already knew I was because Cora had told him, and because a man who has spent 20 years in financial crimes, interview rooms, can read readiness across a table without being told. He opened a folder of his own, thinner than Cora's, but organized with the specific economy of a man who does not include anything that does not carry weight. He walked me through it in sequence. The county lion notice I already had, a $650,000 home equity line of credit, filed against the old Hickory Lake property bearing my forged signature. Confirmed forgery, the signature had been cross-referenced against 4 authenticated samples from documents I had signed in the past decade, and it matched none of them in the 7 points of comparison Spade's forensic contact used as standard. That was the one I knew about. There are 2 others, Spade said. Smaller, but they were filed first. This has been running for at least 18 months. 18 months. The first instrument was filed 18 months ago. I did the math without meaning to. That was 6 months before I retired. My son started while I was still working, while I was still signing my own name to bridges. I did not say anything. I looked at the documents he had placed in front of me, and I read them the way I read structural reports figures first, then dates, then the signature line that was not mine. Cora's hand was on the table beside mine, and neither of us moved. Spade outlined what would be required to build a legally viable case, authenticated evidence chain, forensic certification of the forgeries, and the part that landed differently than the rest, no premature confrontation. Garrett could not know the investigation existed. Any change in Elwood's behavior would register. Spade had seen cases collapse because a father could not keep his voice level on a phone call, and he was telling me this without apology. "You need to perform confusion, Mr. Vance," he said. "Not anger, not suspicion, confusion. An old man who does not quite follow the paperwork. Can you do that?" He said old man without hesitation. I respected him for it. I told him I could do it. I said it the way I say most things I am not entirely certain of flatly without elaboration, which is the register a person uses when they intend to make the uncertainty true through repetition. Can a man who has spent his entire career being precise about things deliberately produce imprecision on command, in front of the person who is counting on him to fail? Can you sit across from someone who has stolen from you and let your face say you do not know? I have been asking myself that question since January. I still do not have a clean answer. In mid-January, Spade called to tell me the forensic analysis was complete. All 3 signatures were confirmed forgeries. We had enough to move to the next phase whenever I was ready. I thanked him and ended the call and stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The lake was outside. The word whenever was in my head. As though ready was a place a person arrives at, I drove home after the Charlotte Avenue meeting and pulled into the driveway and did not go inside. I sat in the car with my hands resting on the wheel, and I thought about what Spade had asked me to build. 38 years of structural work, every certification bearing my signature, every report honest to the last decimal. The things I built were designed to hold under the worst conditions they would ever encounter. That was the standard. That was the only standard that mattered. Now I was being asked to build something designed to fail a performance of incompetence, a careful construction of a man I had never been, and to make it convincing enough that my son believed it was real. The motion sensor light above the garage came on while I sat there, then went off again. I had built 38 years of things meant to hold. Chapter 4 begins the first time I tried to build something meant to break. The first time I let my son believe I was losing my mind, I was thinking about load-bearing tolerances and watching Deanna watch me. I had driven to the dinner, saying the word to myself the whole way there. Not grief, not anger, confusion. Harlan Spade had been precise about it, and I had learned over 38 years that when a precise person gives you precise instructions, the worst thing you can do is interpret them. So I said the word, confusion. I said it until it stopped feeling like a direction and started feeling like a temperature, something I could lower myself into by degrees. The way a structure lowers its own internal stress when the load shifts slowly enough. The table was set for 3. Garrett had made something with chicken, which he does when he wants the evening to feel domestic and considered. Deanna had brought flowers and set them in the center of the table, without being asked which she does, when she wants the room to feel like something other than what it is. I noted both things and said nothing about either. I sat down in the chair. I always take the one facing the window, the one with the lake behind everyone else, and I made a private commitment to the version of myself I was about to perform. Producing a wrong answer when you know the right one is not performance. It is a calculation run backward. You start from the result. You need the other person to believe and work your way down to the gesture. The pause. The slight unfocusing of the eyes that makes it land as truth. An actor performs emotion. What Spade asked me to do was perform the absence of precision, which is a different problem entirely, and harder for a man who has never in his professional life let an imprecision stand. It came mid-conversation the way Spade said. It should not at the beginning, not in response to a direct question, but in the middle of a sentence about something ordinary, when no one was specifically watching for it. I let my eyes go slightly unfocused. I produced a small, effortful sound, the kind a person makes when they are reaching for something that should be closer. Then I said, "My son's name 1 beat too late." And I told the fellow, I said, I told Garrett. Yes, I told him the same thing. "Take your time, Dad. No rush." He said it immediately. Too immediately and too warmly, with the specific cadence of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of opening and has the response already in his mouth. No rush. He had practiced that too. I had spent 38 years reading structural materials for signs of internal preparation, and I knew what rehearsed patience sounds like. But it was Deanna I was watching. She took 3 seconds before she offered me another fork. I know because I counted. I count everything. That is the thing my son forgot when he decided to run this particular plan against this particular man. 3 seconds. A person who is surprised by something helps immediately. A person who is waiting to confirm what they suspected waits to be sure of what they saw. Her expression had moved through surprise, and then through something I could only read as assessment, and then, in the 3rd second, into something quieter and more settled. Satisfaction is the word I landed on driving home. Not pleasure exactly, something more functional than that. The expression of a person who has been monitoring a situation and has just received the data point they needed. The fork fumble came later and was cleaner than I expected. I had planned it the way I planned everything, with a specific outcome and a specific physical action to produce it. And the execution was, if I am being accurate about it, technically correct. Timed, controlled. A deliberate imprecision delivered with the precision of a man who has never produced an imprecision accidentally in his life. She waited 3 seconds on that one too, then asked in the same smooth voice if I needed another fork. I said no, thank you, and picked it up from the tablecloth, and Garrett watched me do it with the patient expression he had been wearing since the name stumble. And I sat across from both of them and thought about bridge tolerances, because it was the only thing that kept my face at the right temperature. They exchanged a glance at the salt shaker. I had held it 2 beats too long, studying it as though briefly uncertain of its purpose. And when I set it down without using it, Garrett looked at Deanna, and Deanna looked at Garrett with the specific brevity of people who have agreed in advance what a particular signal means. I caught it in my peripheral vision and gave them nothing back. What does it cost a man to perform weakness? I can tell you now. It costs him exactly the thing he spent his whole life refusing to be. And you pay it in one dinner, and you drive home, and you sit in the dark, and you feel it. I sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. I had given something away tonight. Something I had carried my whole working life without putting it down. And I had done it correctly, and the performance had landed exactly as Spade said it would, and that was the part that sat wrong, not the failure of it, but the success. She had taken a photograph. I had seen it from the corner of my eye, the angle of her phone, the pause, the casual way she said it, face down on the table before I looked up. Deanna was documenting my decline, which meant someone had told her to. 3 weeks into my performance, I learned that the house I built my life in had walls thin enough to hear my son plan the end of it. Garrett had suggested the overnight stay 10 days earlier, framed as concern. He said he worried about me being alone at night. I said that was thoughtful of him. We were both lying, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so. I made up the guest room and put out fresh towels and went to bed at my usual time, which is what a man does when he has been instructed to perform normalcy and has, by this point in February, become reasonably competent at it. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. Old Hickory Lake makes a particular sound at night in winter, not loud, more of a presence than a noise, the sound of a large body of water, doing nothing and letting you know it. I had slept beside that sound for 30 years. It had never felt like company until Loretta was gone, and after that it had felt like something closer to witness. Tonight, it felt like neither. Tonight I was using it as cover. The voices began past midnight. Low-clipped the specific register of people who believe they cannot be heard and have adjusted their volume accordingly, but not enough. Garrett's voice first, then Deanna's. I lay completely still and regulated my breathing to the slow rhythm of sleep, a long count in. A longer count out, holding myself the way you hold yourself when the thing you are trying to hear is just barely loud enough to catch if you give it total silence to move through. The power of attorney is signed. That was the sentence. Not we are working on it, not we are looking into it. Signed, past tense. My name on a document I had never agreed to, in a form I had never seen, authorizing a man I no longer recognized to make decisions about a life I was still living. I took the next breath on the same count. In, out, still. Deanna's voice answered him. The nursing home tour was Thursday. The intake paperwork was prepared. Once the power of attorney cleared the relevant channels, they would move. She named the facility once and did not name it again, which told me she had been saying it often enough that she no longer needed to repeat it for emphasis. It had become ordinary to her. My address, my house, my lake, ordinary logistics, in a plan she had been managing long enough to find routine. He laughed. A quiet laugh, private, the kind a person makes when they believe no one else is in the room for it. I had not heard my son laugh like that since he was 7 years old on a bicycle in the driveway. That version of the laugh meant something completely different. Between one breath and the next, the driveway came back to me. Garrett at 7, the specific weight of a child's bicycle under my hands, the back of the seat, The moment I let go, before he knew I had. He had kept pedaling. That was the part I remembered most clearly, the way he kept going, without knowing the support was already gone. I let the memory pass. I let his voice in the hallway pass over it the same way. He really doesn't know, does he? It was not a question. He said it the way a person says something they have been carrying for a long time and have finally found the right room to put it down in. Deanna answered him, but I did not register the words. I was registering the laugh, and what it confirmed, this was not obligation or anxiety or even greed in its most basic form. There was pleasure in it. That was the detail I had not been prepared for, and it was the detail that mattered most. I want you to understand what it takes to lie still while you hear your own erasure being scheduled. It takes everything. And it takes the knowledge that moving too soon is the one mistake you cannot recover from. I had been told this by Harlan Spade in a specific sequence of words I had memorized, and I held those words in my chest the same way I held the count of my own breathing as a structure, as a thing designed to keep other things from collapsing. The footsteps moved away. The guest room door closed. I stared at the ceiling for a long time after that, and I did not reach for my phone, and I did not get up, and I did not move from the position I had held since midnight. I heard every single word, and I let him keep talking. What Garrett did not know, what he could not have known, was that the room had better ears than he thought. Spade had told me to be out of the house that afternoon. He did not tell me why. He did not need to. I had learned by then that when Harlan Spade tells you to be somewhere else, you go somewhere else, and you do not ask questions until after. I drove to a hardware store in Goodlettsville and spent 90 minutes walking the fastener aisle and buying 3 things I did not need. I paid with a card, which was the point, a time-stamped receipt placing me 22 miles from the house at a specific time. Spade had told me to keep the receipt. I kept the receipt. I did not know while I was standing in that store, comparing hex bolt sizes, that my daughter was inside the house I had just left. Let me tell you what Harlan Spade's compartmentalization felt like from the inside. It felt like trust, and it felt like being managed. And I could not tell you which one bothered me more, except that both of them kept my daughter safer than my knowing would have. What you do not know, you cannot perform knowing. He had said that to me early in January, and I had filed it the way I file precise instructions, which is without argument and without elaboration. I understood it completely at 4:47 p.m. when my phone rang and Cora's name was on the screen. She had gone in through the side door, her key the one she has carried since she was 12. The home office was the target, the lower desk drawer, which Spade had identified from documents Garrett had filed with the county, and which contained, according to what Cora had found in an earlier search of publicly recorded instruments, the physical originals or copies of whatever Garrett was building the legal case from. She had 4 minutes before Garrett's estimated return window opened. She used 3.5. She was at the hallway door, photographs already taken, phone already locked, when she heard the heels on the kitchen tile. Deanna wore heels in the house. My daughter knew the sound of them by then. 12 seconds. Deanna stood in that office for 12 seconds and did not look at the closet door. I have stood in that same office since then, and I have looked at that closet door every single time. It is the first thing a person looks at when they enter a room and feel that something is not exactly as they left it. I do not know why Deanna did not look at it. I have spent more time than I should have thinking about why. Cora had pulled the door to 3 inches not shut, not open 3 inches enough to see the room, not enough to be seen from the door unless someone crossed directly to it. She had stopped breathing when the heels stopped moving. She told me she counted the seconds by feel rather than by number, the way you count when you cannot afford to lose track of what your body is doing. Deanna looked at the desk. Deanna looked at the window. Deanna left. Cora stayed in that closet for 11 minutes after the office door closed. She waited through the sound of footsteps moving through the house, the sound of a cabinet somewhere, and then the sound she had been listening for, the engine in the driveway, tires on gravel, the fade of both down the road. She walked out the same way she came in, locked the side door behind her, and sat in her car at the end of the road for 5 minutes before she drove anywhere. She called me from the car. She said she had gotten everything Spade needed, all of it. She said it the way a person says something when they are still shaking and do not want you to know they are still shaking. I know that register in her voice. I have heard it twice in her life, and I hope I never hear it again. What is 3 feet? 3 feet is nothing. 3 feet is the distance between a closed case and a daughter who never came home from an errand I sent her on. I think about that every time I hear her voice on the phone, and she does not know I am thinking it. I have not forgiven myself for that distance. I do not think I am supposed to. The operation required it, the outcome justified it. Spade designed it correctly. All of that is true. And none of it touches the part of me that knows I put my daughter in a closet 12 seconds from being found. That is not strategy. That is the cost of it. Those are different things, and a man who has spent his life being precise about structural loads does not get to confuse them. My daughter had been 3 feet from being discovered, 3 feet from losing everything we had built together. Spade called me 2 days after Cora sent him the photographs. He said the documents confirmed everything we had suspected, and one thing we had not. There was a third name on the amendment. Someone outside this family had been helping my son for a long time. Harlan Spade did not ask how we were doing when we sat down. He opened the folder and put the first document on the table, and the room became a different kind of room. Same 2 chairs, same unmarked walls, same frosted glass suite number visible through the interior window. Everything in that office was identical to the first time I had sat in it, except that the first time I had come with suspicion. And this time I had come with a daughter and a closed case, and whatever composure I had left after 6 weeks of performing a man, I was not. Spade placed the documents in sequence. He named each one before setting it down the way an engineer reads load figures into a record flat, precise, no editorializing. The lab confirmation first. He said the words cognitive impairing compound and consistent with long-term low-dose administration, and moved to the next item without pausing for what those words would do to the room. I watched the document land on the table. I read the words, and then I sat with 2 of them long-term for the remainder of the presentation while he kept talking. Long-term. He said long-term low-dose administration. That means it had been happening for months before Christmas. That means every dinner, every phone call, every visit where I felt slightly slower than I should have felt, it was not age. It was deliberate. The second document was the lab report source disclosure, a glass taken from the house during the January visit, chain of custody clean, taken by Cora without telling me, and submitted to the laboratory Spade used for forensic toxicology before she had ever described the kitchen counter to her father. I looked at my daughter. She did not look back at me. She was watching the table the way she watches things, when she has already decided how she feels about them, and does not need to perform the feeling. She had taken a glass from the kitchen in January. She had suspected what was in it before she had told me what she had seen. She had been protecting me from knowing I needed protecting the same way her mother used to do it, in the same silence toward the same end. I did not say anything. Spade was already placing the third document, the HELOC instrument, $650,000 secured against the old Hickory Lake property. Forged signature verified across 4 authenticated samples. Social Security number used without authorization, filed in Davidson County 18 months prior. He set 2 additional documents beside it, a $47,000 instrument and a $93,000 instrument, both filed before the HELOC, both using the same forged signature variant, both bearing my Social Security number, $790,000. I thought about the bridge I certified in 1987, the one near Brentwood on Highway 65. It cost less than that to build. It is still standing. My son spent more than that dismantling me. Total fraudulent exposure across all 3 instruments, $790,000, all secured against the lake house, all bearing my name, none of them mine. Before I tell you what Spade placed on the table next, if this account has meant something to you, if you have sat in a room where someone laid out the arithmetic of a betrayal you did not see coming, drop 1 word in the comments that describes what you are feeling right now. Just 1 word. And please note, the next part includes details reconstructed for clarity and emotional accuracy. What I want you to carry forward is the truth behind them, not the precise sequence. The final document was the POA amendment. Spade set it down without commentary and let me read the 3rd signature line myself. A licensed notary, a name I did not recognize. A disciplinary record for prior document fraud. Currently employed inside a firm with 2 years of existing business ties to my son's investment practice. I did not recognize the name. I had never heard it. That was the most frightening thing Spade said all morning. Not the compound, not the number, but the name of a stranger who had been inside my life long enough to sign his name to the end of it. I want to tell you what it feels like when your daughter puts her hand over yours in a room where everything has just been confirmed. It feels like the one thing in the folder that cannot be forged. Spade closed the folder. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is complete rather than when something is merely finished. Cora reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She did not squeeze it. She did not say anything. She simply placed it there flat and steady, the way a person places a hand when they are not performing comfort, but providing it. She did not ask if I needed it. She simply placed her hand over mine and left it there. And that was the first time in 4 years that kind of steadiness had come from outside myself. I looked at Spade. He waited. "Thank you," I said. Nothing more. There was nothing more to say in that room. Everything that needed to be said was in the folder, and the folder was closed. Spade told us what came next. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation maintained a financial crimes unit that handled cases of coordinated elder fraud, forged instruments, identity exploitation, POA abuse. He had already made a preliminary call. They were expecting to hear from us. My son arrived with a folder 3 days after I sat in Harlan Spade's office and heard everything, and I answered the door with a confused smile because that is what the plan required, and because I had been practicing it for 6 weeks. The folder was Manila Standard weight, the kind a person buys in bulk from an office supply store. Garrett held it the way a man holds something he wants to appear casual about. I noticed the slight curl of his fingers along the bottom edge. I have read enough structural drawings to know when a man is gripping something harder than he intends to show. He said it was future care planning. He said it was standard stuff. He said it would make sure everything was in order while things were a little uncertain. That was the phrase he used, a little uncertain, and I turned it over in my mind the way I would turn over a load calculation that did not quite balance. A little uncertain. He had spent 18 months engineering that uncertainty, and here he was, describing it the way a weatherman describes a passing cloud. I stepped back from the door and let him in. Garrett moved through the house with the comfortable ease of a man who has already decided it belongs to him. I watched the way his eyes moved across the room, not the eyes of a son checking on a father, but the eyes of someone conducting a quiet inventory. I have seen that look before on job sites when a contractor walks a property he expects to acquire. I said nothing. I offered him a seat and took my own, and I folded my hands in my lap the way a man does when he is not sure what to do with them. There is a register a person uses when they have practiced sounding reasonable. It has the shape of patience and the texture of care, and if you are not listening for the thing underneath it, it passes for something genuine. Deanna did not sit. She positioned herself at the kitchen doorway with her arms loosely crossed and her phone held in her right hand, not raised, not put away. She had chosen her angle with the same precision I once used to calculate sightlines on bridge inspections. She could see the documents, she could see my hands, and she could see Garrett's face without appearing to watch any of them. I noted her posture, witness stance, the body language of a person ensuring a transaction reaches completion. She had been in that doorway before on other visits, but never quite like this. This was a different kind of stillness. Garrett walked me through each page. He used the word protective 4 times. He used the word simple 3 times. Every sentence he offered had a second sentence underneath it that he did not say aloud. And I heard both versions simultaneously, the one meant for a confused old man and the one that meant something else entirely. Future care meant asset transfer. Your protection meant his protection. Just a formality meant the last instrument needed. I let him finish every sentence before I responded. I asked him to explain things twice, sometimes 3 times, and each time he did, his voice remained steady and warm, and I cataloged the effort that steadiness required. Do you know how much discipline it takes to make your hand tremble on command? The same discipline it takes to hold it still. The difference is direction. Controlled stillness and controlled trembling use the same muscle. The difference is only in which direction you apply the discipline. When Garrett placed the signature page in front of me, I picked up the pen with a deliberate tremor, a controlled, sustained tremor executed with the same precision I once used to draw load-bearing specifications by hand. I asked him which line. He pointed. I asked again. He pointed again, and in the space between my first question and my second, I saw it 1 second. A tightening along his jaw, a micro-correction in posture, gone before Deanna could register it from the doorway. 1 second of the real man beneath the performance. I have read structural stress reports with less information in them than that 1 second gave me. I filed it. The folder in my mind had gotten very thick. My signature moved across the paper in a slow, slightly degraded version of itself, not so degraded as to raise immediate suspicion, but different enough from my authenticated samples in ways that Spade had already documented and would be able to demonstrate. I was not just signing a document, I was manufacturing a comparison. The pen felt heavier than it should have. That was not performance. That was simply what it feels like to do something that will matter later in a room full of people who do not know it will matter. He said, "That's everything." He took the folder and he said, "That's everything." And he was right, it was everything. It was the last thing he would ever take from me. He just did not know that yet. Garrett left with the folder under his arm and a warmth in his voice that I recognize now as rehearsed relief. 6 weeks. The party was already planned. What he did not know was that I had planned it longer than he had. The trap he believed he was closing had been built around him from the inside, and it would hold the same way everything I ever built held, because I had checked every load, every joint, every point of failure before I ever let anyone walk across it. The suit had been in the closet for 4 years. I had not touched it since the funeral. I put it on the morning of the party because Loretta had chosen it, and because I wanted her in the room for what was about to happen. It was heavier than I remembered. Fabric does that when it has been folded, and still for a long time it holds its shape but settles into itself. The way a room settles when no one has been living in it, and then someone opens the windows again. I lifted the jacket from the hanger and shook it once gently, the way you handle something that has been waiting. The lapels carried a faint sheen at the edges from the last dry cleaning she had taken it in for, sometime in the spring before everything changed. She had held it up in the store and looked at me across the rack and said it made me look like a man who had somewhere important to be. I had worn it to dinner that night and then hung it back and not touched it again until the morning she was buried, and not again until now. I dressed slowly. I buttoned each button with the attention I give to anything that requires care under pressure, working from the bottom up the way I always have. A habit from years of suiting up for job sites where the sequence of preparation was its own kind of discipline. I placed the phone in the breast pocket, confirmed, still recording, still holding everything accumulated since December. I placed the folded document beside it. Then I stood at the window that looks out over the backyard and watched the caterers position the last of the tables. The tent was already up between the oak trees. The long table with the white cloth ran along the near edge of the grass champagne flutes, arranged in a row that caught the morning light cleanly. 2 caterers moved folding chairs into position along the perimeter, working without conversation, the efficiency of people who have done this exact thing many times before. The lake beyond the yard was still and wide, the far bank just visible through the tree line. Everything at that hour carrying the unhurried quality of a morning that does not yet know what the afternoon will ask of it. I want to tell you something about wearing a dead woman's choice on the day you have been building toward for 6 months. It is not grief exactly. It is closer to carrying a tool she selected for a job she knew you would eventually have to do, and trusting that she measured you correctly when she chose it. I did not feel her absence that morning, the way I usually feel it. I felt something more like company. The phone rang at 8:17. I knew it would be my daughter before I looked. She called with the same quality she always calls with. When something matters, no preamble, no reassurance, only the coordinates. "Everything is where it needs to be," she said. "He knows his part." "And the timing?" I asked. "I have been certain for 3 weeks," she said. "See you at noon." Under 3 minutes. Neither of us said my son's name once. The guests began arriving shortly after 2. I counted them the way I count everything, not from habit but from necessity, because knowing the number is part of knowing the structure of a thing. 47 people by mid-afternoon. Former colleagues from the engineering firm, neighbors from up the lake road, a few faces I recognized from my son's professional circle. Most of them people who had known this family for the better part of 2 decades. That last fact mattered to me. Witnesses are not furniture. People who have known you for 20 years carry a different kind of authority when they remember what they saw. My daughter arrived 20 minutes before the crowd thickened. She came through the side gate without looking toward me, found her position near the far end of the long table, and stayed there. The distance between us was not distance. It was architecture each of us placed where we needed to be for what was coming. My son and his wife moved through the crowd with the ease of people who had rehearsed a room. A hand on a shoulder here, a warm laugh there, both of them working the space with the distributed confidence of people who believe the afternoon belongs to them. I held a glass I did not drink from and spoke to the people who came to me and performed the version of myself they expected. Grateful, slightly vague. A man easing into the comfortable quiet of retirement. My oldest friend arrived at 2:15. He was the only one who came directly to me without stopping to speak to anyone else first. He crossed the yard and shook my hand. One firm grip held a single beat longer than a social handshake, then released. No words. In 31 years, I have never known him to withhold words when he had them. The silence told me everything I needed to know. He stepped back, accepted a glass from a passing tray, and moved into the crowd without looking back. He was in position. I turned toward the center of the yard. The afternoon light had shifted past 2:30, the shadows of the champagne flutes stretching longer along the white tablecloth, the whole yard settling into the particular stillness of a late spring afternoon, just before something changes it. I stood where I was standing. I kept my hands at my sides, easy and open. Then the fork tapped the glass. The sound moved across the yard, and 47 people turned toward my son, and I watched him smile at the room and draw his first breath, and I waited for him to begin. My son began with gratitude. He always began with gratitude. It was the most reliable thing about him, and the most dangerous. He thanked the guests for coming. He thanked the caterers by first name. He said the lake looked exactly the way his father always loved it in April, and he was right about that, and I noticed that he was right about it, and I filed it alongside everything else. Garrett's voice in its warmth register is a well-built instrument. I had been listening to it for 34 years, and I understood its architecture the way I understand a suspension cable. The tension is always there. The question is only how much load it is currently bearing. He spoke about the bridges. He mentioned 38 years of service. He said every bridge I had certified was still standing, and he said it the way a man says something he has practiced until it sounds unrehearsed. The guests smiled. A few of them looked at me. I kept my face as still as the lake behind me. Then he pivoted. I had been waiting for the pivot the way you wait for a known stress point, not with dread, but with the particular attention of someone who has already calculated the load. He said the word family. He said the word together. He said we have made a decision, and I noted the plural we, the collaborative framing of a thing that had never been discussed with me at all. He said I had been having some difficulty lately. He said the family wanted to make sure I was cared for. He named the facility. He gave the address. He described it as a place with good light and good people. And I sat at my table and I translated every sentence the way I had been translating every sentence for 6 months. And what he was saying underneath the words he was saying was, this man is finished and we have arranged the room where he will finish. And I want you to understand what it takes to sit completely still while your son tells 47 people you are losing your mind. It takes exactly what I had spent 6 months building, the knowledge that the stillness is not weakness. It is the last wall before everything comes down on the right side. He looked at me near the end. He said, we just want what's best for you, Dad. You understand, don't you? His voice on that last sentence dropped into something that was meant to sound private, meant to sound like the real conversation beneath the public one. 47 people leaned almost imperceptibly toward it. I held his gaze. I did not nod. I did not look away. I waited until he had said everything he had come to say, and then I pushed my chair back from the table, and I stood up. My hands did not shake, not even a little. After 6 weeks of making them tremble on command after every dinner and every performance and every morning, I woke up and chose to wait. My hands did not shake. I want you to know that. I spoke first about bridges because that is where the truth was. I told them what it means to certify a structure, that you are putting your name on a calculation, that the calculation will bear weight, that people will walk across what you have signed without knowing your name or thinking about the math that holds them up. I told them what it costs when another man signs your name without your permission. I kept my voice at the level I use when I explain load tolerances. I did not raise it. There was no need. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and I took out the phone. I told the guests I had something they should hear. I told them it had been recorded in this house in the hallway outside my bedroom in February. I told them I had been in the room. I told them I had heard every word in real time. Now they would too. I pressed play. Garrett's voice came out of the phone speaker and moved across the backyard in the April afternoon light. His voice from February. His voice from the hallway. The voice he used when he believed the house was empty and the walls were not listening. I watched his face while it played. I did not look away from it once. I watched the warmth leave it the way warmth leaves a surface when the sun moves not all at once but steadily, 1 degree at a time, until what remains is the structure underneath. 47 people hearing something they were never supposed to hear do not gasp. They do not move. They simply stop all at once the way a room stops when the thing holding it together has just been named out loud for the first time. The recording ended. The backyard held its silence for a moment that I did not try to fill. Garrett had not spoken. He had not moved. Deanna rose from her chair fast, the movement of a person who has rehearsed a contingency, and she said it was taken completely out of context. Her voice was controlled, but not quite level. I recognized the architecture of that sentence immediately. It was not a defense. It was a request for the story to stop where it had stopped. I looked at her. I smiled the first time all day, a real one, small and unhurried. I told her there was a next part. I had been waiting for her to say exactly that. I pressed play a second time. Deanna was still talking when her own voice came out of the speaker, and the yard went quieter than it had been for the first recording, because everyone understood now that she had known exactly what she was saying. The recorded voice was calm. That was the detail that settled over the backyard first. Not the words, but the register. Deanna's live voice had been rising, finding the pitch of a person who has been misrepresented, performing the texture of wrongful accusation. Her recorded voice was something else entirely. It was the voice of a person making arrangements. It said the 650 clears the account Thursday. It said after the POA transfers, we move the asset. It said the old house is out of his name before he understands what happened. Those were the words in that sequence, in that calm and specific order. She stopped at the word Thursday. Her own voice said it, 650 clears Thursday, and she stopped talking in the middle of her own sentence. 47 people heard her go quiet. That silence was louder than anything I played. I did not look at her after the recording finished. I let the silence do what silence does when it has earned itself. I let it sit. The yard held it for a full count that I did not try to fill. Garrett had not moved. He was looking at the space between his own hands on the table in front of him. And I noted that as a data point, the way I note everything, the angle of a man's gaze tells you where he has decided to go, and Garrett had decided to go somewhere that was not this backyard. I watched that decision happening in real time, and I let it happen because it told me everything about what he had understood the moment the second recording ended. Then Cora stood up. I want to tell you what it looks like when your daughter walks through a backyard carrying 6 months of evidence toward a table full of witnesses. It looks like the most competent thing I have ever seen a person do. It looks exactly like her mother. She moved from her position at the far end of the guest tables, with the accordion folder held at her side, her pace deliberate. Her eyes on the table she was walking toward, and not on anyone who might try to stop her. She had walked this route in her mind before I could tell by the exactness of her path, the way she cleared the edge of each chair without adjusting her stride. She reached the center table, and she opened the folder, and she began placing documents, one at a time, with the same unhurried precision she had used every Sunday morning for 6 months when she called to tell me she had found something new. The forged HELOC went down first. Then the 3 signature comparisons, my authenticated signature beside the degraded one I had produced in March at Garrett's direction, beside the original forged instrument from 18 months ago. Then the POA amendment with the notary's name. Then the bank statement, the single page that showed the disbursement date, the receiving account, the amount clearing on a Thursday in February. She laid them out the way an engineer lays out a load calculation, not for drama, but for clarity, so that the structure of what had been done was visible to anyone who looked. I watched my daughter's face while she worked, and I saw my wife's eyes in it. I had not seen that before, or I had seen it and not named it until this particular moment, this particular light, this particular task that she was completing without flinching. I was glad Loretta had sent her. I was glad I had not done this alone. When the last document was down, Cora stepped back from the table and returned to her chair without speaking. The guests nearest the documents leaned forward. Some of them did not lean forward. All of them were still. Felix Drummond rose from his chair at the far end of the row. He did not look at Garrett. He did not look at me. He looked at the 47 people who had come to a retirement party and were now sitting at the center of something that had no name yet in their understanding. He said one sentence in the voice he uses when he has decided that precision matters more than volume. Elwood Vance built bridges for a living, and his own son tried to burn every single one of them down. Felix said one sentence and sat back down. 31 years of knowing a man, and that was the sentence he chose. I have thought about it every day since. He was right, and he said it in the fewest possible words, which is the highest form of being right. The yard held the sentence the way good concrete holds weight, without comment, without visible effort, simply by the nature of what it was made of. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. I looked at my son, and my son looked at the documents and did not look up. And then at the edge of my vision I saw Deanna turn her head toward Garrett. Not toward the guests, not toward me, not toward the papers on the table, toward him. The expression on her face was not the composure I had watched her maintain for 6 months of dinners and document signings and carefully positioned witness stances in hallways and doorways. It was something under all of that, the expression of a person who has just understood that the structure they trusted to hold was never designed to hold them. She had not known everything. Some part of what Garrett had built he had built without her. And she was calculating that now in real time, in a backyard in April, in front of 47 people who were watching her do it. Garrett did not look back at her. He was still looking at the documents. And then two men I did not recognize came through the side gate. Deanna turned to Garrett before the officers had fully cleared the gate, and I understood watching her that whatever they had built together had always had a load limit. And they had just reached it. She said 4 words. This was your idea. She did not raise her voice. That was the thing I noted first, the flatness of it, the complete absence of heat, as though she had already moved past the part where feeling was useful and arrived at the part where accounting was all that remained. Garrett answered her in the same register, low and controlled, and said she had known about the account. She cut back immediately. She had known about the account, she said, and nothing else. Not the compound, not the notary, not the rest of it. And now 47 people did. That was all. Less than 2 minutes. The exchange had the specific ugly compactness of something failing at a joint, not a collapse, not a drama. Just the sound of 2 people discovering at the same moment that the arrangement between them had never been what either of them believed it was. I watched it, and I felt nothing I would call satisfaction. I filed it the way I file everything. Let me tell you something about watching 2 people you once sat at a dinner table with turn on each other in a backyard in front of 47 witnesses. It is not satisfying. It is only very, very quiet, the specific quiet of a thing that was always going to end this way. The officers came through the side gate 4 abreast, unhurried, credentials on lanyards at their chests. 4 TBI financial crimes officers in plain dress, moving with a particular calm of people who know the arrest has already been earned and see no reason to announce what has already been decided. No sirens, no lights. Harlan Spade had been very specific about that when he described the protocol. He said there was no need to perform an arrest that had already been earned. I had remembered that sentence the way I remember calculations I have checked twice, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted it exactly right when the moment came. Harlan followed 3 steps behind them, carrying nothing, wearing the same expression he had worn every time I sat across from him in the Charlotte Avenue office, the expression of a man who has already done the work and is simply present now to confirm it was done correctly. The yard reorganized itself around the officers without anyone being asked to move. 47 people shifted the way a crowd shifts when it understands that what it is watching has changed categories from private to public, from accusation to consequence. The guests nearest the document stepped back. The guests nearest the gate stepped sideways. The path opened the way a path opens when it has to. Elder abuse, criminal administration of a harmful substance, forgery, financial fraud. The lead officer read the charges in an even voice with the backyard for an audience. And each charge landed in the open April air with the weight of a thing that had been true for months and was only now being named in the correct room. 4 charges. My son's name attached to 4 charges in a backyard where a banner still said, "Congratulations, Elwood," in yellow letters above the caterer's table. I noticed the banner. Nobody else seemed to. I watched Garrett's face while the charges were read. He did not move. He did not speak. He looked at the lead officer with the expression of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at a number he was not prepared for, even though the variables had been visible the entire time. Deanna stood 2 feet to his left and did not look at him again. Whatever she was calculating now, she was calculating it alone. What do you say to a man who is about to be arrested for trying to erase you? I still do not have the answer, but I know a father does not stay in his chair. I know that much. The officers positioned themselves 2 beside Garrett, 2 beside Deanna, and it was at that moment that Garrett turned and looked across the yard. He was looking for me. I knew it before his eyes found mine, the way you know a load is shifting before the instrument confirms it. When he found me, he went very still. Not the stillness of composure, something under composure. Something that composure had been built on top of for a long time, and that was now visible for the first time, because everything built on top of it had just been taken away. He looked at me the way he had not looked at me since he was 4 years old on my shoulders, not performing anything, just looking. I pushed my chair back from the table. I stood. The wool of Loretta's suit settled against my shoulders the way it had that morning, when I put it on heavier than expected and exactly right. I began to walk toward my son through the crowd, and the crowd parted without being asked the same way it had parted for the officers, because a yard full of people understands without being told when a thing has to happen. The crowd parted as I walked. I could see my son's face getting clearer as I got closer. I still did not know what I was going to say. I kept walking anyway. When I reached him, the officer stepped back one pace. I did not ask him to. He simply understood the way people sometimes understand things they were not trained for, that this was not his moment. It was ours. I stood in front of my son and I looked at his face and I did not say anything for a moment. Not because I was finding the words. I had stopped looking for the right words sometime in the last 6 months and started looking instead for the true ones. I had one true thing to say and I said it. I told him I remembered the boy who called me Superman. I said I had been remembering him for 6 months, through every document, every dinner, every morning. I woke up and chose to wait one more day. I said I wanted him to know that I forgave him, not because he had earned it, not because what he did could be undone, or because the law was going to go easy on him for it. I forgave him because I was not willing to carry what he had done for the rest of my life. That was the whole of it. I said it in a voice I did not raise. Forgiving a person who has not asked for it has nothing to do with generosity. It is a decision made entirely in your own interest, the recognition that carrying what someone else did will cost you more in the end than setting it down ever will. I had too much left ahead of me to spend it on that weight. I had too much left to build to let that happen. Garrett did not speak. I had not expected him to. What he did instead was something I had not seen from him in years, something I had almost stopped believing was still possible. He cried. Not for the backyard, not for the 47 people standing at a careful distance, not for the officers or the documents, or the banner still hanging above the caterer's table. He cried the way a child cries when the performance runs out, without architecture, without design, without any audience in mind, just the sound of a thing breaking that had been under pressure for a very long time. He cried. My son stood in a backyard in front of 47 people and cried without performing it, and I understood watching him that the boy on my shoulders had always been in there. He had just been buried under 30 years of decisions that went the wrong way. I could not get those decisions back. I could only let him know I remembered before the door closed. The officer stepped forward after a moment, quiet, unhurried, the same way he had entered the yard. The moment closed the way. Moments like that close, not with a sound, just with a shift in the air, a change in who is responsible for what comes next. I turned before the car moved. I made that choice deliberately, the way I make every choice that is going to have to live with me. I turned away and I faced forward toward Cora, standing at the edge of the yard. Because I had already said what I needed to say, and the rest belonged to the law, and I was glad to let it. Deanna was escorted through the side gate last. She attempted something on the way out, a sentence the beginning of a frame, something about what it looked like versus what it was, something about what she had been put through. I heard the shape of it without listening to the specific words because I had heard sentences built like that before, and I knew what they were for. They are not for the person speaking them. They are for anyone who might still be persuadable. Deanna said it was not what it looked like. 47 people had been in that backyard for 3 hours. Not one of them answered her. That silence was a longer sentence than anything I could have said. The vehicles pulled away without fanfare. No lights, no announcement. Just 2 cars moving away from a house on a lake on an April afternoon, carrying what they were supposed to carry, leaving behind what was supposed to remain. I stood at the edge of the yard and listened to the sound of the engines getting smaller and then becoming part of the general quiet of the afternoon, the water, the wind in the oak tree, the slow movement of 47 people beginning to understand that they were free to go. They left in the way people leave when they do not know what to say. Some of them touched my arm, some of them nodded. One man, a former colleague from the engineering firm, a man I had worked beside for 11 years, stopped in front of me and held my gaze for a 3 count. And then walked past without speaking. And that was the most he could have done, and he knew it. The backyard emptied slowly, and then it was empty. The vehicles had pulled away, and the backyard was very quiet. Cora was standing at the edge of the yard looking at me. I looked back at her. Neither of us spoke yet. There was still the house. They left the way people leave, after something they were not prepared to witness quietly, with a hand on a shoulder, choosing words that did not ask anything of me. The first guest was gone by 4:15. After that, they moved in pairs and small clusters, finding their jackets from the chairs where they had draped them hours earlier, when this had still been a retirement party, and the afternoon had still belonged to a different version of itself. A few of them stopped and said something, the kind of words people reach for when the right words are not available, words shaped more like presence than statement. I received each one the way I receive most things. I noted it, I held it, I let it settle without trying to name it. One man gripped my hand with both of his and did not say a word at all. That was the one I remembered afterward. The backyard thinned by degrees. The caterers had stopped moving and stood quietly at the far end, waiting for a signal to begin clearing. I thought that was one of the more decent things I witnessed that afternoon, the particular decency of people who understand that some rooms need to empty before they can be put back in order. The tables held the specific evidence of an event that had changed direction, midway through half-empty glasses, a champagne flute still full at the far left end. Chairs that had drifted from their original positions, in the way chairs drift when 47 people spend 3 hours in a yard together and stop thinking about where they are sitting. A full plate of food sat untouched near the center table. Nobody had gone back for seconds. My oldest friend was last. I had known he would be. He crossed from the far edge of the yard, where he had been standing since the vehicles left, and he walked directly to me without stopping, and he put his hand on my shoulder and gripped it once, held it 1 beat longer than necessary, and released. He did not say anything. He had already said the one thing that needed saying, and he understood, as he always has, that everything after that first true sentence belongs to the person who has to carry it. He turned and walked through the side gate without looking back, and I watched him go until he was through it. Then I was alone in the yard for the first time since 7 that morning. I exhaled. Not deliberately, the breath simply came out on its own, the way breath comes when a thing that has been held for a very long time is finally finished being held. The yard was a yard. The tent was still standing between the oak trees. The white tablecloth had a crease down the center where the wind had lifted it once and set it back down wrong. The banner above the caterer's table still said, "Congratulations," Elwood in yellow letters, which struck me as the most honest thing in the yard at that moment, not because it was true in the way it had been intended, but because it was still there, unchanged, belonging to a version of the afternoon that no longer existed and not yet knowing it. I sat down in the chair I had been sitting in when my son began his speech, not because it was the nearest chair, because I wanted to sit in the same place and feel the difference. My daughter appeared at the back door sometime after that. I did not hear her come out. She was simply there the way she is simply there when she has decided to be somewhere without announcement, without performance already present by the time you notice her. She was carrying 2 mugs, and she crossed the yard and handed one to me without asking whether I wanted it. The ceramic was warm in both hands. She sat down in the chair beside mine, and we looked at the yard together in silence at the half-cleared tables and the drifted chairs and the banner still hanging, and neither of us said anything, for a while, because neither of us needed to. The warmth in the mug was the first thing I had felt clearly since the vehicles pulled away. She had cleaned the kitchen while the guests were leaving. I knew this without being told that was where she had gone, when I was standing at the edge of the yard watching people find their cars. And cleaning the kitchen was exactly what she would have done, because she handles things that need handling the same way her mother handled them, without being asked. Without drawing attention to the handling, as though the doing of it is simply the next correct thing in a sequence that has already been decided. After a while, she leaned her head against my shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort, exactly more, the gesture of 2 people who have been through the same long day from different positions, and have arrived finally, at the same place at the same time, and have nothing left to perform for anyone. The coffee went cold while we sat there. I noticed it gradually, the warmth leaving the ceramic, by degrees the mug becoming just a mug in my hands. I did not mind. I had been holding things all day. This was the first one that did not require anything back. "How are you?" she said eventually. Not a question exactly. The kind of thing you say when you already know the answer might take a moment to find. I thought about the answer I had been giving for 4 years. I am fine. I had said it to the doctor, to my oldest friend, to myself in the dark on Sunday mornings. I had said it so many times it had stopped being a lie and become something more neutral than that, a placeholder, a way of closing a door without slamming it. I will be, I said. 2 words, not a performance and not a promise. Just the truest thing I had in me at the end of that particular day, offered to the one person in the yard who would know exactly what it cost and exactly what it meant. She nodded once and did not push further. And we sat there until the light was gone from the yard entirely, and the banner was just a shape in the dark, and the lake beyond the tree line was something you could feel more than see. The formal end of a structural failure isn't the moment the debris is cleared. It's the moment the insurance adjusters and the forensic auditors sign the final settlement. For 31 years, I lived by the finality of a signature on a blueprint. But I never expected the most significant signature of my life to come from a son who was forfeiting his freedom to avoid a trial he knew he couldn't win. My attorney, a man whose voice had become the metronome of my mornings, called on a Thursday in August. The Tennessee heat was pressing against the kitchen glass, making the air inside feel heavy and still. He told me Garrett had accepted the terms. 3 counts. A plea deal negotiated with a TBI that would trade years of litigation for a guaranteed sentence. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat at the kitchen table until the ice in my glass had long since turned to lukewarm water. There is a hollow sort of victory in watching the law do exactly what you spent 6 months preparing it to do. I had built the trap. I had recorded the voices, photographed the forgeries, and performed the role of a fading old man with a precision that would have made a stage actor weep. But sitting there in the silence of the house I had nearly lost, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like an inspector standing over a bridge that had been intentionally sabotaged and then condemned. The structure was saved from collapse, yes, but the damage to the foundation was permanent. Garrett was my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, and now he was a set of docket numbers in a Nashville file. I picked up the small green notebook, the one that had held my life together since December, and I looked at the page where I had first written the word HELOC in red ink. Beneath it, I now wrote the date and the word closed. The remediation of the house was a slower process than the criminal one. My daughter Cora took the lead on the financial restoration, navigating the labyrinth of Davidson County records with a ferocity that I suspect she inherited from her mother. We had to challenge the 3 fraudulent instruments, proving to the banks in the state that the Elwood Vance who signed those loans was a phantom created by a man with a stolen Social Security number. The $650,000 lien was the hardest to scrub. It felt like a stain on the wood of the house itself. Every time I walked past the office where Garrett had forged those documents, I could feel the ghost of his betrayal. But by mid-July, the letters started arriving official, cold, and beautiful. Notice of rescission, release of Leanne. My name was returning to me one document at a time. I filed them in a new accordion folder, a white one this time, to signify a clean break from the dark folder Harlan Spade had used to dismantle my son's life. I spent a lot of time that August just sitting on the back porch watching the water levels of Old Hickory Lake. I found that I was relearning how to exist in a house that wasn't a crime scene. For months, every floorboard creak was a potential threat, and every phone call was a tactical maneuver. Now the silence was just silence. It was a strange transition. When you spend half a year in a state of hypervigilance, performing a role of mental decline, while your mind is actually sharper than a razor, the sudden return to normalcy feels like the bends. I had to remind myself that I didn't need to fake a tremor anymore. I didn't need to unfocus my eyes when Deanna walked into a room. Deanna, who had rejected the plea deal and was preparing for a trial that would likely consume her next 2 years, was a shadow I had successfully cast out. Her refusal to admit fault was the final piece of evidence I needed to realize she had never truly been part of this family. She was a scavenger, and scavengers don't repent. They just look for a new carcass. I thought about the word justice. People use it as if it's a destination, a place where you arrive and finally feel whole. But standing in my kitchen looking at the lake, I realized justice is just a balance sheet. It's the math working out at the end of a long, painful calculation. The accounts were being frozen, the house was being cleared, and the people who tried to erase me were being moved to rooms with bars on the windows. That was the math. The emotional cost, the fact that I would never again look at my son without seeing the man who tried to drug me into a nursing home, that was the interest on the debt. That was the part the law couldn't fix. I realized then that my retirement wasn't starting the day I left the state of Tennessee. It was starting the day the TBI file was moved to the convicted drawer. By the end of that Thursday, I did something I hadn't done since the party in April. I went into the guest room, the one where Garrett and Deanna had stayed during their observation visits, and I stripped the bed. I took the sheets down to the laundry room, and then I went back and opened the windows wide. I wanted the Nashville air hot and humid, as it was to flush out the last of the rehearsed concern and the whispered plans. I stood in the middle of the empty room, and I realized that the house was mine again. Not because the bank said so, but because I had stopped being a character in my son's play. I was Elwood Vance, 67 years old, and I was still the one holding the keys. I walked back to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, and for the first time in 8 months, I didn't check the breast pocket of my jacket for a recording device. I just sat, and for a man like me, just sitting was the hardest, most necessary bridge I had ever had to cross. By September, the house had begun to breathe again, though the recovery was measured in small, tactile victories rather than court dates. Cora started arriving every Sunday morning without the ritual of a phone call, a change that felt like a bridge finally settling onto its piers after a long period of thermal expansion. We spent those afternoons doing the kind of work that had been neglected, while I was busy performing a mental collapse for an audience of 2. One Sunday, we tackled the north porch gutter. It had been pulling away from the fascia since the spring rains, a literal sign of neglect that I had documented in my mind, but lacked the spirit to fix while I was fighting for my life. Cora held the base of the ladder, her hands steady on the aluminum, while I climbed with a drill and a handful of galvanized screws. "You're leaning left, Dad." She called up her voice, carrying that familiar mix of concern and precision. "It's the pitch of the roof, Cora. It's calculated," I replied, though we both knew I was just tired. I'd driven the last screw home and felt the gutter snap back into its intended alignment. It was a minor repair, a few dollars in hardware, and 20 minutes of labor, but as I climbed down, I felt a disproportionate sense of relief. For months I had been an inspector of my own ruin, watching things break and noting them down as evidence of my decline. Now I was a builder again. We sat on the porch steps afterward, the smell of cut grass and lake water thick in the Nashville humidity, and for the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't a barricade. It was just the quiet of 2 people who had finished a job. Later that afternoon, the heat drove us inside to the kitchen, where the light hits the linoleum in long, dusty slats. I had been meaning to rehang a photograph that had been sitting on the sideboard since the December I first found the forged lean. It was a shot of the lake from 1987, taken the summer we finished the back deck. Loretta is in the corner of the frame, partially blurred, because she was turning to say something to a toddler-age Garrett. I took my spirit level, the one Cora insisted was out of calibration, and pressed it against the frame. I watched the green bubble float toward the center, oscillating slightly before finding its true home between the 2 black lines. "Perfectly plumb," I said mostly to myself. 2 degrees off. Cora countered a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. It was our running joke now, a way of acknowledging that perfection is a moving target, especially when you're trying to reconstruct a family from the remnants of a betrayal. I hammered the nail, hung the frame, and stepped back. The house was filling up again, not with furniture, but with the weight of things being where they belonged. It was a stark contrast to the hollowed-out feeling of March, when every object in this room felt like it was already being appraised for a yard sale. The most difficult part of the afternoon came when Cora went to find a vase for the sunflowers she'd brought. She reached for the top shelf of the pantry and pulled down the old green recipe notebook. I hadn't touched it since the day of the party. It had been Loretta's, a collection of handwritten instructions for everything from sourdough starter to the specific way I liked my coffee on Sunday mornings. Cora set it on the counter, her thumb tracing the frayed fabric of the spine. "I haven't looked at this since she died," she whispered. "I couldn't handle the handwriting." I pulled the book toward me and opened it to the very last page. I had discovered the entry back in June, but I hadn't shared it with her yet. It wasn't a recipe. It was a single paragraph dated 2 weeks before Loretta went into the hospital for the last time. Her script was shaky, but determined, the ink slightly faded, where she must have rested her hand. I slid the book across the counter so Cora could read it. "He will figure it out," the note read. "He always does. He's built for the long haul, even when the wind is against him. Just remind him to eat and tell him the level is fine, even when it isn't." We sat in the kitchen as the shadows grew long, the notebook open between us. It was a message sent forward in time, a load-bearing beam she had installed decades ago, knowing we would eventually need it to hold up the ceiling. I realized then that Loretta had known me better than I knew myself. She hadn't seen a Superman. She had seen a man who was obsessed with the math of survival, a man who would eventually find the cracks in his own foundation and fix them no matter the cost. Cora didn't cry, which I appreciated. She just reached out and placed her hand over mine, and for a long moment the house was entirely still. "She knew," Cora said quietly. "She knew he'd try something, and she knew you'd catch him. She knew I'd need a reason to keep looking," I corrected. I took a pen from the drawer, the same one I'd used to sign the confused documents for Garrett, and I flipped to the blank page following her entry. I wrote one sentence: "The level is sitting right at center, Loretta. Thank you for the reminder." I closed the book and put it back on the shelf, not in the pantry this time, but on the mantel in the living room. It was no longer a book of instructions for the kitchen. It was the final certification for the life we had built. We didn't talk about the legalities or the plea deals for the rest of the evening. We just made dinner use too much salt and watched the moon rise over the water. The hardest part of rebuilding a bridge isn't the steel. It's the internal tension of the cables once the temporary supports are removed. For 6 months, I had lived inside a skin that wasn't mine. I had trained my hands to shake on command, my eyes to lose their focus in the middle of a sentence, and my voice to carry the thin, reedy uncertainty of a man who was losing his grip on the world. By October, the legal battles were receding, but the old man I had created still lingered in the corners of my daily life. I would find myself reaching for a glass of water and hesitating, waiting for a tremor that didn't need to be there. I would enter a room and pause at the threshold, a ghost of the performance telling me to look confused about why I had walked through the door. Reclaiming oneself is a deliberate engineering project. I had to systematically deconstruct the lie I had built. It began with the small things: the way I dressed, the way I spoke to the teller at the bank, the way I stood when I looked at the lake. I stopped wearing the oversized, slightly rumpled sweaters Garrett had always commented on, the ones that made me look smaller and more fragile than I was. I went back to my starched work shirts, the ones with the double-stitched pockets for a slide rule and a notebook. I started speaking in the flat, declarative tones of a state bridge inspector again. I didn't wait for permission to be right. I just stated the facts as I saw them. It was a slow process of recalibration, a steady tightening of the bolts until the structure of Elwood Vance was once again capable of carrying its own weight. One morning, I drove to the local hardware store in Goodlettsville, the same one where I had bought those 3 hex bolts back in February to create a digital timestamp for Harlan's spade. I walked in, and for a split second, the old habit kicked in. I felt my shoulders slump. I felt the urge to squint at the aisle markers as if I couldn't read the word fasteners. I caught myself in the reflection of a display of lawnmowers, and I stopped. I stood up straight. I walked to the counter, looked the clerk in the eye, and asked for a specific grade of structural adhesive for a project on my dock. I didn't fumble with my wallet. I didn't ask him to repeat the price. When I walked back to my truck, I felt a strange, sharp surge of adrenaline. I had defeated the old man in a public place. I was no longer a character in a tragedy. I was a customer with a repair to make. The psychological aftermath was most visible in my study. For months, that room had been a war room disguised as a den. The desk had been a surface for hidden recording devices and secret folders. In mid-October, I decided to gut it. I took down the heavy curtains that Deanna had always drawn shut to help me rest. I let the Nashville sun hit the oak desk for the first time in a year. I cleared away the piles of medical pamphlets Garrett had left, the ones about managing early onset decline and choosing the right care facility. I burned them in the fire pit by the lake that evening, watching the glossy paper curl and blacken into ash. It was a cleansing fire, a disposal of the materials used to build my cage. Cora came over while the fire was still smoldering. She stood beside me, the orange light reflecting in her eyes, and she didn't ask what I was burning. She knew. She had lived through the same performance, though, from the opposite side of the stage. She had been the only one who knew the old man was a mask, and I realized that I owed her a version of myself that was no longer guarded. "You're standing differently, Dad." She noted, her voice quiet against the sound of the water lapping at the shore. "I'm tired of being small, Cora," I said. "I'm tired of the math of it." "The math worked," she reminded me. "The numbers don't lie. You saved the house, and you saved yourself." I saved the house. I agreed. But I spent 6 months acting like a man who was dying. You start to believe the things you tell yourself if you say them long enough. I'm just trying to remember what it feels like to be the guy who signs the reports again. I went back to my old office at the Department of Transportation one afternoon, just to say hello to the few colleagues who hadn't retired yet. I didn't go as a victim or a survivor. I went as a peer. I sat in the break room and talked about the new bridge designs for the I-40 expansion, and for 20 minutes, no one looked at me with pity. No one spoke slowly. I was just Elwood, the guy who knew more about concrete density than anyone in the district. When I left that building, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My identity wasn't tied to the betrayal of my son. It was tied to 31 years of honest work. The old man was finally dead, and the engineer had returned to take his place. That night, for the first time since December, I slept without the light on in the hallway. I didn't need to see the door to know I was safe. I didn't need to listen for footsteps. The house was quiet, not because it was empty, but because the tension had finally found its balance. I realized then that the final confrontation hadn't been with Garrett in the backyard. It had been with the version of myself that Garrett had tried to force me to become. And as I lay there in the dark, I knew that the foundation was solid. The bridge was open, and the traffic was moving again. The Civic Center in Hendersonville is a building that smells of industrial floor wax and the quiet, persistent effort of a community trying to hold itself together. I arrived at Community Room B on a Tuesday in late October, carrying the green notebook not as a shield, but as a record of a successful inspection. There were 22 people sitting in those beige folding chairs. Men and women my age, some older, some leaning on canes, others sitting with the stiff, defensive posture of people who suspect they are being lied to, but don't yet have the vocabulary to prove it. I didn't stand behind the lectern at first. I stood in front of it, wanting them to see the man, not the office. I started by talking about bridges. It was the only way I knew how to explain the physics of a betrayal. I told them about the EI-65 span I certified in 1987, and how a bridge doesn't fall because of a single storm. It falls because of 1,000 microscopic fractures that someone decided were too small to matter. I watched their faces. They weren't looking for a lecture on engineering. They were looking for a mirror. When I moved from concrete to the $650,000 lien Garrett had filed against my house, the room went so still I could hear the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. I am 67 years old. I told them, my voice steady stripped of the reedy tremor I had spent months perfecting for my son's benefit. And for 6 months, I was the architect of my own disappearance. I let a man I loved tell me I was losing my mind so that I could stay close enough to watch him steal my life. I'm here today because I don't want any of you to have to play that part. The social worker in the front row was scribbling on a yellow pad, but the people in the chairs weren't writing. They were leaning in. I broke down the mechanics of the fraud, not the emotions, but the logistics. I explained the long-term low-dose administration of the compound Deanna had put in my water. I explained how a power of attorney can be turned into a weapon if the notary is in on the scheme. I showed them copies of the 3 different signature variants I had documented: the real one, the forged one Garrett created, and the shaky one I had manufactured to bait the trap. The math is the only thing that doesn't have an agenda, I said, tapping the notebook. If the numbers on your bank statement don't align with the life you're living, don't let anyone tell you it's just your memory failing. Memory is subjective. A decimal point is a fact. One woman in the 3rd row raised a hand that was visibly shaking, not with a performance, but with genuine cold-pressed fear. She asked me how I knew when to stop waiting. She asked how I found the courage to turn my own son over to the TBI. I looked at Cora, who was sitting in the very back, her arms crossed, watching me with a quiet, fierce pride. I told the woman that courage had nothing to do with it. It was about structural integrity. If you see a crack in a load-bearing beam, you don't ignore it because you like the person who built the house. You fix it before the roof comes down on everyone inside. I spent the next hour sitting in a circle with them, answering questions that were more like confessions. I realized that the old man persona I had created was a reality for many of these people, not because they were actually declining, but because the world around them had decided they were no longer reliable witnesses to their own lives. I gave them Harlan Spade's number. I gave them the contact for the TBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I told them that being difficult was sometimes the only way to stay safe. As the meeting broke up, a man about my age approached me. He didn't have a question. He just wanted to shake my hand. He held it for a long time, his grip firm, his eyes searching mine for a sign of the person I had been before the December envelope arrived. I thought I was the only one, he whispered. I thought I was just getting old and bitter. You're not old and you're not bitter, I told him. You're just under a load you weren't meant to carry alone. Get an inspector, get a witness. Don't let them sign your name for you. Walking out of that civic center into the crisp October air, I felt a different kind of lightness. For months my story had been a secret, a tactical advantage I held over Garrett and Deanna. Sharing it didn't diminish its power. It redistributed the weight. I wasn't just Elwood Vance, the man who caught his son. I was Elwood Vance, the man who showed 22 other people how to look for the cracks. Cora was waiting for me by the truck, the sun catching the red in her hair. "You were good up there, Dad," she said as I climbed in. "You sounded like yourself." I felt like myself, I admitted. I think that's the part I miss the most. Not the house, not the money. Just the right to be certain about what I'm seeing. We drove to the diner, and as we sat in the booth, I realized that the public testimony was the final certification of the repair. The bridge wasn't just standing, it was being used. It was carrying traffic. I took a sip of my coffee, black no sugar, exactly the way I liked it, and I didn't look at the door once. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The inspection was over. The structure was sound. By the time the first frost hit the banks of Old Hickory Lake in November, the internal architecture of my life had finally settled into its permanent form. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes after a structure has been tested to its absolute limit and held firm a silence that isn't empty, but full of the knowledge of its own strength. I spent that morning in the kitchen, the room where the first cracks had appeared nearly a year ago. The sun was sharp and low, cutting across the linoleum, and for the first time in 365 days, I wasn't looking for a shadow. I wasn't checking the seals on my windows or the level of the water in my glass. I was just making toast. The green notebook sat on the counter one last time. It was full. Every page was a record of a battle fought in the dark dates, times, chemical names, forged interest rates, and the whispered conversations I'd transcribed while lying still as a corpse in my own bed. It was the most honest thing I had ever written, and yet it was a relic of a war that was over. I picked up a black marker, and on the very last blank space of the inside back cover, I wrote the final entry foundation, inspected. All repairs certified. Bridge open to traffic. I didn't put it back on the mantel this time. I walked it down to the basement and placed it in a cedar chest with my old slide rules and my professional engineering seal. It belonged to the past, now a piece of history, not a manual for survival. Cora came over at noon carrying a box of old ornaments. We were early for Christmas, but neither of us cared about the calendar. We were building a new set of traditions to replace the ones that had been poisoned. As we worked, she told me that the TBI had finished their final report on the notary, who had signed the fraudulent POA amendment. He was losing his license and facing his own set of charges. It was another bolt tightened, another joint secured. We didn't dwell on it. In this house, the names Garrett and Deanna had become like the technical specifications of a failed project, noted archived but no longer discussed in the daily operations of the building. "What are you going to do with the study, Dad?" she asked, gesturing toward the room that had once been my son's base of operations. "I'm turning it into a workshop for the local historical society," I said. "They need someone to help archive the original bridge blueprints for the county, someone who knows how to read the old hand-drawn tension schedules." She smiled, and for a second she looked so much like Loretta, it caught my breath. "So you're coming out of retirement to look at more bridges?" "Not to certify them," I corrected. "To remember them. There's a difference." The afternoon faded into that soft blue Nashville twilight. I walked down to the dock alone and stood at the very edge of the wood, looking out at the water. The lake was a dark rippling glass, reflecting the first few stars. I thought about the man who had stood here in December, terrified that his mind was rotting from the inside out. I thought about the old man I had played so convincingly that even my own son believed I was a shell. I realized then that I hadn't just saved my house or my money. I had saved the right to be a man who is believed. In the engineering world, we talk about the factor of safety, the extra strength we build into a structure to handle the loads we can't predict. I had spent my life building that margin into concrete and steel, but I had never realized I'd built it into my own character. My factor of safety wasn't my bank account. It was my daughter's loyalty, my friend's silence, and my own refusal to let a lie become the truth. I had been over-engineered for the tragedy Garrett had planned for me, and that was why I was still standing. I turned back toward the house. The lights were on in the kitchen, warm and steady against the cold. Cora was inside the silhouette of her moving past the window as she set the table. It was a simple scene, ordinary in every way, but to me, it was the most complex and beautiful structure I had ever seen. I walked up the path, my steps firm on the frozen ground, my hands steady in my pockets. I am Elwood Vance. I am 67 years old. I am a retired bridge inspector, a widower, and a father. The house is mine. My mind is mine. And the road ahead is clear. As I opened the back door and felt the warmth of the kitchen hit my face, I didn't look back at the lake. I just walked inside, closed the door, and sat down for dinner. The inspection was complete. The bridge was solid. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was home. I have told you this story because I could not tell it for 67 years without paying for the silence. That is the first lesson I would offer anyone listening. The silence you keep to protect someone else will eventually cost you more than the truth ever would have. Do not make my mistake. Do not file things away because naming them feels disloyal. Loyalty is not the same as blindness, and love is not the same as looking away. This is what I know about family betrayal, now that I did not know before. It rarely arrives as an attack. It does not knock, it does not announce itself. Family betrayal walks in through the front door, wearing your son's face and your late wife's favorite suit as its backdrop, and it calls itself care. If something feels wrong in a document, in a relationship, in a room, Trust that feeling before you talk yourself out of it. Write it down. Get help. You are allowed to protect yourself, even from the people who are supposed to love you. This family story is not really about fraud or forgery or a backyard in April. It is about what happens when a man spends too long believing that the people around him are who they used to be. I believed in a version of my son that had not existed for years. That is on me. I own that. I believe God did not put me through this to break me. He put me through it so I could stand in front of someone someday and say, "It can be survived." A family betrayal of this kind leaves marks. But marks are not the same as damage. A family story does not end at the worst chapter. Mine did not. If this stayed with you, I am glad. Leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done differently in my position? I read everyone.